Okay, call to order the City of Newburgh Rate Review Committee for today, August 23rd, 2023. Jen, will you do the roll call for us, please?
Yes, I will. Thank you. I'm apologizing before I start that I did not double check name pronunciation. So my apologies if I get somebody's name wrong. Jennifer Bean. Here. Thomas Rinke.
Here.
Ron Sinicki.
Here.
Ned Knight.
Here.
Derek Duff.
Here.
Derek Wharf.
Here.
Anna Arsenault. Here. And Peggy Kilberg.
Here.
Thank you.
I think you did a good job on those
Thank you.
pronunciations. Okay, now that the roll call's over, why don't we take a minute and say the Pledge of Allegiance? Stand, please. Okay, the next item is conducting the election of officers. So at this point, I will take nominations for chair. So, and it's okay to nominate yourself if you're interested. Let me ask how, show of hands, I think there are 3 of you, but are returning to this committee. 1, 2, 3, okay.
This is Ron Sinicki. I will nominate myself for chair. And I'll nominate Ned for vice chair.
Okay, thank you. We have a nomination. Is there, oh, we have to have a second to a nomination.
I'll second that.
Thank you. And are there any other nominations?
I'll nominate myself for secretary.
Okay, we'll get to that.
Oh.
Thank you. We'll hold that thought. Okay, that's been nominated and seconded for Ron Sinicki to be our chair. And I've heard no other nominations. So hearing none, let's take a vote. All in favor, just say aye.
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 Thing about these mics, if one's left on, then the next one's not as loud. So I should have had a show of hands. Any opposed? Okay, Ron, congratulations or consolations, whatever. Okay. So the committee appoints Ron Sinicki as chair of the rate review committee. And now I'll take nominations for vice chair.
This is Ron. I nominate Ned Knight.
Okay, Ned's been nominated. Any seconds?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Any other nominations? Hearing none, let's take a vote. Raise your hand if you're in favor of Ned as vice chair. Opposed? Okay. Okay. Either unanimous or almost unanimous. Thank you very much. Okay, then the committee needs to appoint a secretary. And are there any nominations?
So I'll nominate Jen Bean. Is it, you go by Jen or Jennifer?
Either's fine.
Jennifer Bean. I'll second that.
Okay, there's been a nomination made and seconded. Are there any other nominations? Show of hands, please. Looks to be unanimous again. Okay, so the committee appoints Jennifer Bean as secretary of the rate review committee.
So the agenda. So it doesn't have who is doing the overview of utility rates. Is that going to be Deb? Yeah, remotely.
Yes, before that, I'll just do a brief introduction of the staff.
Please.
So Deb Gallardi's on here. She's our rate review consultant. She's virtual tonight, but she'll be in person for the rest of the meetings. I'm Katie Strode. I'm the finance director for the city. And then
Lance Calvert, I'm the city engineer.
And then you might also see Sarah Wilson, who's the Assistant City Engineer, probably sometimes at the meetings. And then this is Jen Elkin. She's our Management Analyst. She's filling in for our recorder tonight. So you'll see some different staff here, but if you have questions during the presentations, please feel free to ask. Deb's going to start off with a financial presentation, and then Lance is going to do a presentation on our different capital projects on the utilities.
Okay, great. Thanks. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I will share my screen. Oh, I need to be abled.
I think we can run the presentation for you.
Oh, okay, that works even better.
Is that better?
Sure.
Okay.
Great, okay. So you can go ahead to the next slide. What we typically do on the first night of the rate review committee process is to just do a little background and overview of the rate development process and let you know about what the next steps will be. So this won't be heavy into numbers and analysis other than just to provide context for the current rates and rate structures. Next slide, please. So just in terms of some background, just make sure, I'm not sure what experience the new members have with utilities and utility financing. So on the next slide, you'll see that these utilities that we will be reviewing, water, sewer, stormwater, and street maintenance, are utility enterprises of the city. And what that means is they are funded directly by their own rates and charges. So the utility rates fund about 90% of the expenses of the utilities, and systems development charges, which are the charges for new development to cover a portion of the capital improvements, fund about 6%. And other fees and charges specific to the systems fund another 3%, and a little bit from interest income. So they're self-supporting enterprises, and which is different than the general fund, which is funded in part by taxes. So these systems we review. I say we because I worked with the city on the last couple of rate reviews. Every 2 years, the financial plans are updated and rates are adjusted accordingly. Next slide, please. So just to point out that on your municipal service statement, that there are a couple other fees that you receive that are outside of the rate review process. That's the public safety fee and the communication officer fee. Those are established by a separate ordinance and have their own, council makes the decisions in terms of those rate adjustments. But the water, sewer, stormwater, and transportation utility fee, you can see on this is just an example bill just to orient you as to which systems here that we're talking about. Next slide. So the rate review process, it includes 3 main components. The first is to identify the financial needs of the systems. So this includes the capital improvements. Those are the improvements to the physical infrastructure of the system. There's debt service, which is paying back borrowing associated with previous improvements for the systems, or in some cases, as in the case of the water treatment plant, most likely will be future debt service. Operation and maintenance costs are the staff and materials that are needed to run the systems. And then there are required contingencies and reserves to that are part of standard financial planning. We then, once we establish what the costs are, and we do that on an annual basis, we evaluate the revenue sources, which, as I mentioned, is primarily the rates. So how much revenue is projected to come from the existing rates that have already been adopted, and other fees and charges, and what additional revenue may be needed. The rate recommendations then are related to the overall revenue increases needed for each system, and also to the rate structure. And we'll talk a little bit about the rate components as we walk through each system. Next slide.
So question,
Cool. Yeah.
so is the purpose to basically break even from a cash flow perspective?
Great question. So with utility systems, we take a longer term. So when you say break even, it is not a profit enterprise, for-profit enterprise. So there's no profit involved. It is, but there is planning for future capital. So the city has, and the rate review committee has had a longstanding policy and practice to minimize the amount of debt that's issued, because debt costs the city and ratepayers more money in the form of interest costs. And but capital improvements are not even, and you'll see as we get into the individual systems, they can be lumpy, meaning one year you might have a major capital expense and the next year something less. So you need to be able to plan for money in the bank to fund those kinds of uneven improvements. So it may be, and is often the case under good financial planning practice, that you will have reserves in the bank to cover those future capital improvements, and just to protect against unforeseen circumstances.
I have a related question to that, Deb. I was going to ask under the first, under identifying financial needs, how are those amounts determined for contingencies and reserves?
You know, we'll really get into that a little more for each as we get into it's a little hard to have that too much of a detailed discussion about that without diving into the specifics. But I will just say it's based on industry standard practices around and the city's financial policies, but generally speaking, it factors in some percent of the annual revenue that comes in as kind of a rate stabilization reserve. Also, we look at the value of the assets and how much annually should be replaced in terms of capital improvements, and that's part of considering how much of a contingency or capital reserves. There's several different types of reserves. So it's not just one, but when you do your own financial planning for your business or your home, it's typically recommended you have 6 months rainy day fund or contingency or reserve. It's a similar kind of thing, except we're talking about very expensive infrastructure. And so the capital component of that makes it the setting of reserves a more significant and important component.
Thank you.
And I apologize, I can't see you all when I'm in screen sharing mode. So yeah, if I can't see if there's a hand raised or something. So just somebody help me out if there are questions. Okay, just to give you a little context with utility rate trends nationally, this table shows you at different kind of increments, first being the last 20 years, what the average water wastewater bills, and when we talk about water wastewater, we're including stormwater in that too. It's all water related. What the average annual percent increase in those bills have been nationwide, and how that compares to general inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. And you can see that generally, up until the last couple years when inflation really took off, that utility bills have been increasing at least twice the rate of inflation. And that's because there is a need for capital replacement, that for years and years and years, utilities weren't replacing their infrastructure in a timely manner, and there was therefore a backlog of improvements. Also, there have been increases in regulatory requirements and other factors that have caused the need to increase spending for capital improvements, not just keeping pace with inflation, but to build additional capacity in the rates to pay for primarily capital improvements. But there are also requirements associated with operation and maintenance costs too, that also the city is forced to comply with. So this is a national trend. And you can see from this chart, the figure on the right-hand side, that the costs in the western portion of the United States have tended to be significantly more than other parts of the country as well. Next slide, please.
So question, oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
So question about that, and I was a bit surprised by the chart on the right, and I've seen a lot of comments by citizens of Newburgh about the rates and complaining and that sort of thing. Why is it that the West is so much higher? I mean, one would think we have more water, so why is it so much higher? Is there a reason behind that?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, there's always so many different factors that go into the rate. And part of it is just what other funding mechanisms, some other in Oregon, we have significant tax limitations. So I mean, we aren't funding a lot of these utility enterprises from the taxes. And this chart is just looking at the rates. Regulatory wise, I don't know, Lance might be able to answer that question more than I can, but I think that there are very expensive additional sources of water, for example, that many of the utilities in the West have to address. I do work in Arizona, a lot of work in Arizona, and the costs associated with securing future water supplies are very, very significant.
Majority of that map, this is 170, is high desert.
Yeah.
Oregon and
That's true.
Washington,
It's not just
the
Oregon.
west side of
Yeah.
Oregon and Washington is a little bit.
Yeah.
The entire half, that's California
Yeah.
west side, and that's a low desert.
Fair enough.
So it's almost all desert.
Mhm.
Yeah. I can
Yeah, good point.
on that
Yeah.
too. Just to give you guys a little bit of my background, I've been in municipal work and engineering my entire career. So over 25 years working for local government, including in the Midwest and Southwest, and now in Oregon, where I've been working in the Portland metro area for over 11 years. But there are a lot. What you see in this breakdown, I think nationally, is sort of also indicative of how the United States works in general. Utility rates in particularly the Midwest and South also reflect the lower cost of just doing business in those areas. A majority of utility expenses are going to be, we'll talk a lot about capital, which is a sort of a flexible place to be with utilities. The less flexible place to be in utilities is the personnel expenses, base operating expenses, and materials and services expenses. And by materials and services, usually the vast majority of that is utility billing. So we are actually in utilities, water and wastewater in particular, are a big portion of our expense is electricity. Right. So we consume a lot of electricity because we use a lot of that to power pumps, systems, treatment plants. Use a lot of oil in transportation, trucking, you know, all of those things. And when you're in the Midwest and in particular in the South, where you have a whole lot of really cheap base infrastructure, gasoline in where my parents live in Columbia, Missouri is less than half the cost of gasoline here. And the reason for that is that all the big pipelines and all of the big gas lines, natural gas lines, all the big just the treatment of the crude oil in refineries, everything into power is all located there. So they have the geographic advantage of just cheaper infrastructure in general because of their location and where things are available to them. The West is very highly regulated, and so that puts a crimp on things. There aren't any refineries really to speak of in Oregon like there are in southern Texas that's connected to these massive pipelines that transport everything to the Midwest. And so you get down into Arizona, it's a little different because they use nuclear power for a lot of what they do. Not a lot of nuclear power in Oregon, if any. And so, so there's these sort of like basic overall premises of why things are cheaper in the Midwest, which then translates into lower pay, in the Midwest, which is one of the reasons I don't work in the Midwest. It just depends on where you are geographically. And a lot of that expense is just those base level items like asphalt. Like we don't think of, like when you're talking transportation and the transportation fee, there aren't asphalt plants in Oregon like there are in other, and really all the way probably into Colorado. I mean, I think there's a couple around Seattle, but you don't have that industrial machine like you have in some of those areas of the Midwest and South and Southeast. And so you'll typically see expenses cheaper in the Southeast and the Midwest, where they're more accepting of those kinds of industrialized operations versus the Northeast and the West, where there's a lot more regulation on what can and cannot be built to provide that base level of infrastructure. And so I think that's probably on a national trend why you tend to see those things happen that way. So regardless
Great context.
of quality,
Wow.
it's there.
Get very helpful. Great. Okay. So moving along to back to
CPI figures, is that core inflation or is that total inflation?
it is CPIU, or which is generally what we benchmark the, and I am not a CPI expert, so I don't, I can get back to you on what that represents exactly, but it's the CPIU.
Thank you.
Okay, so then coming back to Newburgh and what the bill increases have been the last 2 years. You can see on the left, the overall, the individual system percent increases in revenue. Again, the public safety and the communication officer fees being separate from the rate review process. And the overall bill increases being between about 4.5% and 5%. All right. And we'll be obviously talking much more about the rates and the bills as we address each system individually in the coming meetings. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Wanted to walk through a little bit more detailed on the rate development process. And this one you can click through a couple of times. So as I mentioned, we are basically developing a financial plan for each system. which is an annual cash flow projections over a 5 to 10 year period, looking at the sources of funds, which primarily are the user rates and the SDCs, and the operating expenses. As Lance said, personnel costs and electricity costs are very significant part of the utility enterprises. And in addition to the capital improvements and the debt service. I think there's, yeah, and then one more. So the other requirements then are transfers back to the general fund to pay for indirect costs associated with support services and just overhead, general overhead and city administration. The individual reserves and the fund are part of the annual planning amount that we're targeting the rates for. So we talk about kind of the revenue slope, that's the annual system-wide percent increases. So on that previous slide, it showed that the revenue slopes for water and sewer are about 3.5–4%. Stormwater has been a higher percent increase, but it's a much smaller bill. So that is, yeah.
Could you give an example of what franchise fees are required?
I believe, and Katie can correct me if I'm wrong, is it 7%, the franchise fee? Oh, a franchise fee is the transfer is, well, I'll let you explain that, Katie.
That's just our internal charge, because we ourselves are users also of the water and sewer systems. So we have an internal franchise fee charge of 7% for our own use of those systems.
Okay.
And the city charges other utilities like the power and the cable companies, things like that, for franchise fees as well. Generally for using operating within the right of way, where the water and sewer lines and things go. Okay, next slide. So when we put together the forecast, there are a number of factors that we consider. Obviously, the city's budget process, which establishes the operation and maintenance costs. We start with the budget, and then we escalate the budget. The budget, it goes through a separate budget committee process. And so then it's a matter of forecasting forward, because the budget is just a single year document and we're looking at a longer term financial plan. So forecasting inflation and other drivers of the operation and maintenance costs increases, which have to do with other economic factors as well. The master plans and regulatory requirements feed into the capital improvement plans that Lance will be talking more about. And the operational portion of the capital improvement plans are funded by the rates. Growth related costs can be funded by systems development charges also. So that helps to take pressure off of the rates. And we, as I mentioned, look at the current rate revenue and compare that to the cost, and then work to determine what modifications need or rate increases might be needed within the 2-year planning window that the rate review is looking at. We look at a longer term period, but you make recommendations on 2 years. I think click forward a little bit more. In terms of forecasting the rate revenue, customer growth and water consumption trends are important factors. And you'll see when we talk about the individual systems that consumption trends have been trending down, that as you know, water sales are impacted by installing low flow fixture units and just general conservation. But customer growth does add more customers to the system who can help to pay for some of the fixed costs of the system. And to the extent that the SDCs are somewhat, are very much determined on both the fee levels and the growth trends. So they tend to be less stable than the rate revenue. Okay, next slide, thanks. This just give you a snapshot of the requirements of each system, and you can see that the sanitary sewer has the most expenses. These on the left-hand side these are millions of dollars. And it just gives you a sense as to the breakdown of what is the rates are paying for. And you can see that for both water and wastewater, the operation and maintenance costs, which is the green portion of the bar, are about 66% of the total expenses. And sewer has already quite a bit of debt that the rates are helping to repay, as well as cash funded capital. The water system today, it has very limited debt, but you will likely be needing to look at a significant increase in the debt to pay for the water treatment plant. Stormwater is primarily operation and maintenance costs, though part of why that rate increase has been higher for stormwater in the past is because the need to build in additional capital funding capacity. That's the newest of actually street maintenance is the newest fee, but stormwater was implemented much more recently than water and sanitary in response to new regulatory requirements. And so those rates have been phased in over a number of years to build the capacity to pay for the operation and maintenance first, and then for the capital improvements. And street maintenance is just maintenance costs. It's capital preservation costs entirely. Okay.
Yeah, about the street maintenance, does that have to do specifically around street maintenance as it pertains to like water, if they need to add a new water line and they got to rip up the street and then repair it? Is that what that entails as an example?
I can answer that, Deb, but no, the street maintenance tough fee is strictly for base pavement maintenance. So anywhere where we're like milling and resurfacing, we did a couple streets this year where we did full depth work. Stuff like that is really what that fee is for. And the reason you don't see O&M under street maintenance is, remember, we have a gas tax revenue that really helps fund a lot of those operations, day-to-day operational expenses.
And is it because it has to do with the storm then, or?
No,
There's no relationship in particular to any of this other stuff?
No, certainly you could have a project where you could combine multiple funds. It's not necessarily uncommon to use some stormwater fund to fix a stormwater issue while, using water funds to replace a water line. And then typically the water line funds will pay for whatever work the water improvements or repair is doing. And then it makes sense sometimes to maybe resurface the rest of that street. And so you'll use street funds to do some of that. So that is something that can happen. But really, I think street maintenance fees are becoming more and more common because the gas tax is not keeping up with the expense of basic operation and maintenance of our transportation infrastructure. The federal gas tax was last increased by, I want to say, President Clinton. And we haven't had an increase federally since that time. And when Clinton was in office, I think asphalt cost $45 a ton. And now asphalt costs $120 a ton. So expenses, and this is the thing I think that we'll get into as we proceed, is you'll see that the goal is to keep revenue in trend with your expense and not allow it to dip to where you're, going backwards. And gas tax has for the last several decades has not kept up with expenses.
Thanks, Lance.
I have a
Okay.
question on that. Can I ask a follow-up quickly? How long is the street maintenance or the transportation utility fee? How long has that been in place? Does anybody know?
I think it was 2016. What was that right, Katie?
Yeah, I was gonna say 2015 or 2016.
So that was in place as a shift off the general fund from the road department?
No, it was out of the street fund, never out of the general fund.
Okay.
It was just, it was designated specifically so that we could keep up with pavement maintenance around town. The street fund does a whole lot of other things, like Elliott Road, for example, all of the new improvements out there, that's all coming from our street fund, but it's not coming from the TUF.
But
Because
prior to
that's,
2016, these road maintenance is now subsidized through this fee. We're out of the
street fund,
street fund.
yes, and we just weren't keeping up. Cause we get a lot of complaints from people saying, I have potholes on my street. And so this was kind of a way for us to start keeping up with that pavement maintenance.
Thank you.
To build on that question, yeah, exactly. The point, right, is that gas tax used to cover everything. It doesn't cover everything anymore, and it hasn't for a while. And so what a lot of the communities did is defer maintenance because they didn't have extra revenue. And then they had to find a way to start funding these base improvements because potholes and problems kept building. And so they create as very much a trend in that last 20 years or so, last 15 in particular, to start street maintenance fees to cover those kinds of base operations at the local level for local streets. And there's a whole history of, interaction between the state and the feds and local on how do pavement maintenance. You go outside of Oregon, a number of states use sales tax revenue to pay for transportation expenses. So, which is not something that's really done in Oregon. So it shows up on the utility bill instead. Some places, I know Clackamas County recently adopted a fee on vehicle licensing, which is an option in Oregon. And so there was that can only happen at the countywide level and not at the local level. So they increased their vehicle registration fees to help offset some of that ongoing expense that wasn't keeping up with the gas tax revenue. So a lot of ways to get to good outcomes, I suppose.
And not, I mean, I brought it up because not that I'm against street maintenance, I think Newburgh's got a tremendous problem with street and sidewalks. So, but it just seems a little strange to have it be part of this to me, but I don't know if that's part of this committee to decide that at all, but it seems like it should belong somewhere, but this seems strange to me. But
I want to add to that. And is it Tom or Thomas?
it's Tom.
Tom.
Yeah.
So that's the number one concern I hear is why are we subsidizing road, public safety, these other things? Some of them are by ordinance, I understand, but they're not water, sewer, utility related. Why are they being on here? And to me, it's a shift from the general fund I'm not saying it's not necessary, but there's other options. There's local options for working capital. There's bonds for capital improvement projects. This is a shorter way to get there. The concern I hear and the concern I have is these are more permanent than not. Once you create an increase, you're not going to decrease it. So as we talk about rate increases and or the relevance of fees, what they're subsidizing, they don't go away necessarily. The lift to get them on is one thing. I've never seen one go off. So I just wanted some history on when that was established and how long it's been in play. I do appreciate your comment about how is it relative to water specifically or utilities. And I think we cleared that up, that it's really a mechanism to fund road improvements.
A gap that there exists.
And just to comment on that too, I think one of the reasons that it went on the utility statement versus like a local option or a general obligation bond for property taxes was that we have several entities in Newburgh, like George Fox, for example, who don't pay property taxes, but obviously use the roads, use public safety resources. And so this was a way to get them to contribute a portion of that towards these services.
Specifically in Newburgh, we have a larger population of churches and the George Fox University that don't, that are the tax methodology that you see in other areas specifically don't work for Newburgh because of the populace that we have. So they all use the roads, but we need to collect the fees to go off and support the roads. But the normal revenue stream wouldn't support that. It would be unproportional.
Yeah, no, 100%.
And so that's why there's a methodology why they did it. And so that was important to understand.
I was also gonna say, one of our chief exports for economy is, wine tourism. So like in the summer, the people coming through Newburgh and through Yamhill County, putting a levy on licensees for cars in Yamhill County isn't gonna fix people coming in and out and really be proportional to the, I guess, driving of individuals coming through our city during the summer as well. What was the debt instruments that we use for sanitary sewer and for water as well?
They're a full faith and credit obligation.
So can you clarify for us? We're gonna adjust the rate as far as, we're gonna approve the proposal that Deb and I think Lance work together to come up with a proposal for us. And that's what we approve. Changing what is in the rates. Can we just say zero for city, for the streets, if we wanted to go zero, if that would be one thing we came up with, or I wanna make sure what's within our scope.
Yes, so the city will present based on our needs, what we think we will need for an increase, and then that is up to the committee to deliberate that. And if you say no, that is with your purview to recommend that to city council.
Just because we're going over background, I want to emphasize what's going to happen is they're going to walk through each one of these systems. As you have questions about that system, it behooves you to ask those questions. We had one scenario where somebody had, well, all my statements were clearly captured. I had no idea what they were talking about. So as we go through the system, ask your good questions as you are doing today, which is phenomenal. Keep asking those questions and get them answered and get your feeling for it at the time of that. Because what's going to happen is after we go through, each meeting is going to go walk through these systems. At the end, we're going to say, okay, cool. Here's the summary. Are you okay with it? It's more efficient if you ask your questions and you get your answers at the time of activity.
Yeah, and we should be adequately presenting why we need these certain increases or not.
And just for scope of this group, we only impact the municipality fees, correct? We can't come in, like, for example, with the transparency on the street maintenance. We wouldn't say, okay, we're gonna, take that transportation fee and you need to find another we wouldn't say, okay, well, we need to go find some other instrument to collect that through property taxes. We're really only focused on that municipality bill that each household gets on a monthly basis, correct?
Yeah, I believe for that one in particular, it would take a council action to remove the transportation fee.
Your degree of freedom, though, is you can go zero. They say our proposal is zero, because what happens is our proposal goes to the city council. And so we can say, we want to go zero, we want you to fund it a different way. I challenge, though, see what they did and why they did it, to see it actually made sense, like I said.
If I could just add a little bit, I'm just barely a year into being on the council. And I've had the same questions you guys are asking, in particular, the public safety and the communications. So what you can do once this work is done on this committee is please show up and make public comment. You don't even have to wait for it to be on the agenda at the city council, but we need to hear from our citizens that, there must be a different way. And frankly, we are looking into some of those things. That nothing happens overnight, but we're going to work to get those off if we can. Particularly the public safety.
One more question, and maybe it's a broader question, and it wasn't covered to begin with, is who are we representing in terms of this committee? Are we representing the people of Newburgh and the businesses as well? Or who?
Yes, that you are representing the citizens and Newburgh and water. water payers or
And
users of
anyone
the
who uses
utility.
water
Yes,
in
anyone who
whatever
uses
city
our
is different.
utility systems.
Okay. And storm and.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Directed
let's-
at-
oh,
Going. You got
Okay.
discussion points.
Okay. So this slide, just, again, this is using data from the prior rate review. These numbers will be updated. But this gives you a sense as to what the rates are funding versus what they need to be funding in terms of capital. So this just showed the average annual funding from rates in blue compared to the average annual CIP, which is capital improvement plan, that was based on the prior update. So you can see in each case that there was, particularly for water, that there was a significant deficit in terms of what the rates are funding currently and where they need to be. Thus, that was part of the reason for the rate increases. And this is after we had accounted for other funding sources like grants, reserves, and debt. The city did do an excellent job of getting some grant funding, which, you know, has not been part of prior rate cycles until this most recent one, where there was some dollars available for infrastructure in the last couple of years. Next slide, please.
Here's that. Is this like past year?
This is from 2 years ago, the rate review committee. As part of that rate review process, we'll be updating. This is just to give you a sense as to where the rates are today versus, or where they were 2 years ago versus the capital improvements that were the average spending for capital that was forecast for that last 5-year period.
Can we
So, yeah.
Can I clarify that, because I'm hearing what you're saying there, Ron. The blue bar is the actual, or that was the forecast, but the orange bar was the actual?
No, the blue bar was looking at the current annual revenue available from rates to fund capital improvements on average for the year. The orange bar was looking at the 5-year capital improvement plan and taking an average of that. That was the average for that 5 years. So there's a disconnect between what the rates could fund and what they need to be funding on an average basis. And because the practice has been to phase in and smooth rate increases over multiple years, it's important to consider not just what's next year, but what's the horizon, the total 5-year horizon need to be. So it just shows that the rates, partly why the rates have been increasing over the price or over the level of inflation, is to play catch up with the capital improvement needs. Okay. So just to summarize some of the key factors that that impact whether rates, things that put downward pressure that help mitigate rate increases versus things that put upward pressure and cause the need for rate increases. On the plus side, customer growth generally is a net gain in terms of as more customers are added to the system, they bring a systems development charge revenue and additional rate revenue. And because a lot of the costs are fixed, the cost of serving those additional customers doesn't increase at the same rate. So generally, more customers mean the costs get spread over a larger base and helps to keep rate pressure down. Debt refinancing prior to the current situation of high interest costs, city was able to get favorable borrowing terms on the debt that it did have, and leveraging reserves and grant funding to keep future borrowing costs low, all put downward pressure on the rates in terms of not causing the ability to have rate decreases, but mitigating rate increases. But on the other side, the significant capital investment needed, as I just showed, that the rates, even with the last rate increases, are not likely sufficient to fund capital within the next 5-year window. The existing debt service that continues on and catch up from prior years, that to fund the pavement maintenance that is you know, the basis or the what was in the planning window, the transportation fees, when they were put in place, were not increased for a couple of years. And so the city lost ground with the ability to fund pavement improvement projects, which was the reason that rate went into place. So that's the problem with deferring rate increases, is losing pace, particularly in high inflationary times when construction and operating costs are both increasing significantly. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of just general, the things that we consider in terms of good, sound financial planning is the practice of having regular, moderate adjustments to the rates help minimize the need to have significant, like double-digit increases, what we could say rate spikes. And so that's why this committee every 2 years looks at the rates, and adjustments are made, generally have been made by council every year, is to avoid having single year increases that are more significant. When we get into the rate structures, we'll talk about where the rate revenue is coming from, because there's multiple components, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But also that reserve piece of having an operating contingency and capital reserves to allow for fluctuations in expenses and revenues. So that segment was kind of about just how we evaluate the overall revenue needs and the rate increases. We also look at the individual rate components. And so, when we do that, we follow principles, industry principles established by American Water Works Association and the Water Environment Federation, which has manuals on how to develop defensible and equitable utility rates. And it gets into things like how much should come from the fixed monthly service charges versus the variable rates that are based on water consumption. How do you determine the rates for individual customer classes, and customer classes being a residential customer versus a business versus an industry. So we will talk about those things with respect to water and sewer. And the bottom line is that these are user fees. And so one of the guiding principles is to recover costs in proportion to system use. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show you the rate structures and the current rates, just so that as we start talking about it in future meetings, for first up, we'll be talking about water. That you have some familiarity with it, because on your utility statement, you just see the total bill. But the bill is comprised for water of 3 separate components: the billing charge, which is the flat charge per account. There's and so that covers things like the customer service costs, the IT, data kind of billing system costs, those sorts of things. The meter charge is scaled based on the size of the meter. Most residential customers are served by a 3/4 inch meter. And so that is the fixed component. It is both a charge to recover the cost of the meter, but also is a kind of a standby charge to recover a base level of costs and partly the debt service, because that is a fixed, stable revenue source. And then there's the variable or volume charge, which is charged for each unit of water that's consumed. And it is measured in terms of hundreds of cubic feet, which is CCF is the abbreviation. So it's a fairly complex structure. When you look at it, there are three different components. And within the components, there are different charges depending on your meter size and your customer class. You'll notice that the volume charge varies based on the customer class because the service requirements are different, because of the seasonality of the use and being the primary consideration for water. So as I said, we will be getting into this in more detail, just trying to give you a base level of understanding of each of the rate structures this evening.
I have a quick question about, there was a line in there from outside city. Are these homes or property or outside the annexation zone? That's what that is?
Yeah, they're city of Newburgh, but they're in like Yamhill County, so outside city limits.
Okay, so they don't have pumps per se, they're still connecting into city water, but they're charged a different rate because.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The sewer rate structure also has a service charge and a variable or volume charge. It doesn't have a meter charge. The meter charge is associated with the water. Though the metered water use is the basis for how the sewer is billed as well. And you'll see that there is fewer customer classes. But the difference between the rates of those classes has to do with the strength or the concentration of the wastewater, because there's a lot more pollutants in a restaurant discharge than there is in a single family home. Okay.
Question on that, is there some reason why a single family and a multifamily have the same volume charge?
It's because it's both domestic strength wastewater. It's toilets and sinks and kitchen waste. The concentration doesn't differ. The volume may differ, and you pay in that same rate for each unit of volume. So if I'm in an apartment and I'm using 4 units, I'm going to pay less than somebody in a single family home that's using 8 units. But the price per unit is the same because the wastewater concentration is generally the same.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep. Transportation utility fee has multiple customer classes, as you can see here, and you see the different uses within the classes. Again, it's a usage-based fee that's estimated in proportion to trips generated over the course of an average day. Industrial in proportion to the square footage of the building. So again, that's the unit of measure. It's scaled like water and wastewater are scaled based on water use. Transportation utility fees are scaled based on the trips generated per 1,000 square feet based on national data that relates to the different types of land uses. So industrial and warehouse have a lot of area, but fewer employees and things to generate the trips. So they pay a smaller fee per unit. Office, also has quite a lot of square footage perhaps, but not as many employees. And then it goes up, the rate goes up per 1,000 square feet when you get to more intense trip generating uses like retail, supermarkets, fast food kinds of things, which generate lots of trips. So this is the standard rate structure that's used in the state. There's at least 24 other cities and more that are in process of developing these fees for the reasons that Lance articulated. And then you see that the charge per dwelling unit, in this case, you do see a lower fee for multifamily compared to single family because there are generally fewer occupants per dwelling unit for a multifamily, and so they generate fewer trips. Finally, yeah.
Just for future reference on the non-residential, is that like per 1,000 square feet? Are we doing that on a per square feet basis? So if you had a 1,200 square foot versus a 1,800 square foot, do they just kind of round to the nearest thousand, or how does?
Oh, that's a good question. Katie, do you know the answer to that? I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
I actually don't know either. I'll have to find out.
Okay.
Stormwater is the simplest of the rate structures. Here, all single family residential pay a flat fee of $15.63 per month, and non-residential pays in proportion to equivalent dwelling units. And an EDU is the square feet of impervious area that is consistent with an average single family home. So an average single family home is just under 2,900 square feet of impervious area. So that's rooftops, driveways, things like that. And non-residential customers, when the city established the utility initially, and when new customers are added, they determine the amount of impervious area for a non-residential customer, and they are billed on that basis. Because impervious area causes the need for stormwater management. So customers are charged in proportion to impervious area, which is again the standard utility structure for this type of service.
Quick question, are there other, well, I haven't talked personally, but I understand Hillsborough uses a system where each owner's impervious area is determined and they're billed on their own. So somebody with a small isn't being charged for the average, where a very big one isn't paying all of it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so there are different approaches for single family charges. There are some that are flat like this. There are some that are tiered, meaning that you're put in a subclass based on your size. So you might be small, medium, large. And the small might pay, half of the average, and then tier 2 would pay the average, and then, and then the larger homes would be either measured or charged a higher fee. That is becoming more common practice as these stormwater rates have increased. When the fee was first put in place, it was like, $3 or something. So it didn't make sense to really have some sort of tiering. But yes, as the fees have increased, there are a number of communities that have gone to either a tiered or a measured. Measured is more administratively complex for the city and would require quite a bit of work to get that system in place, the data in place to bill on that basis.
Thank you.
Okay, just wrapping up my part and then turning it over to Lance. So the next steps, if you'll click through there, we're going to be focusing on the water. Doing that first piece, which is to forecast the capital and operating costs, projecting revenue under the existing rates, and considering taking a look at that. That's the most I guess dynamic system at the time because of of the water treatment. We know that there's a major capital improvement project that that the city is under regulatory requirement to make significant improvements. So that will be the first one. We're starting with what probably will be the most complicated financial plan of the systems. And we'll be back to report on the initial findings on the 13th of September. Thank you, slide advancer. I appreciate that.
Any other questions for Deb before we transition to capital?
So, I messaged you prior to the appointment, so I do have an excused, exit here. Am I able to get the recording so I can be prepared in preparation for the September meeting? For Lance's portion primarily is what I'm.
Oh,
focused
sure.
with, yeah.
We'll put the recording on the website.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And I think the PowerPoint's already
Yep.
with the agenda, so. While we're bringing up the PowerPoint, I just start with general, tonight's presentation is mostly just a general overview of the capital functions of the utilities. And and a little bit about operations, and this is all infrastructure, so it's sort of like this, everything you build has a cost, and both operationally and initial construction costs. A lot of people think of it like they think of their homes, right? You got to pay to build it, and then you got to pay to maintain it. And unfortunately, it's like, it always seems like there's another expense if you think about your own home. I know that's the case with me in my home. So we can get through hopefully a general overview tonight of all of the different utilities and capital systems. And then as we move into our future meetings, and we'll have a deeper dive into each of the individual utilities, both on the financing side and on the capital side, where we'll get more in depth on capital improvement plans and future capital needs of the systems. Thank you. You can advance to the next slide. I think this is just general overview. So just starting with general overview, and I don't have these in any particular order, but sort of, I guess, starting from the most to the least, wastewater system, certainly the most intense, probably I would say, of the utility functions of the city. Wastewater sewer collection system is substantial in the city of Newburgh. Over 80 miles of pipes, over 1,700 manholes. Pressurized force sewer pipe system too. We have basically most of sanitary sewer gets captured from individual homes and businesses. Any customers of the utility travels into the public system along the street. Buried underneath the street is a complex web of utilities that people don't see that help us act, in our daily lives. And that all runs by gravity traditionally to lift stations in the city that are strategically placed based on topography of the community, where a lot of it is pumped through pressurized systems to the wastewater treatment plant, where the plant treats the wastewater prior to discharge into pretty much the Willamette River, although we do have another system there. One interesting thing that I noted when I started here in the wastewater system in Newburgh, Newburgh made the decision years ago to have part of the public system be all the individual sewer laterals to each individual property in the public right of way. That is not necessarily the case in a lot of other jurisdictions. A lot of cities have the private property owner own all the way to the sewer main, which is typically an 8-inch or larger diameter pipe. And then usually you have a 4 or 6-inch diameter pipe running off of that to your individual residence or to your business. And in Newburgh, the city actually owns and maintains those individual lines all the way to the edge of the municipal right of way of the street. So that is in effect extra maintenance and extra expense that the public system is absorbing versus a private individual property owner. Again, the decision was made long ago. Next slide. The wastewater treatment plant is the really intense capital part of wastewater system. It's located at the south end of town, close to the Willamette River, right off of Winooski, I believe is the right street. Built in 1987, it uses very traditional treatment system and has a capacity of about 4 million gallons a day. In the summer, that runs at about 2 million gallons a day. In the winter, we usually are around 3.5 million. And you can see part of the issue with gravity pipes and lines and anything in the ground is that in the winter in Oregon, it rains. And so you get a lot of groundwater inflow into the system for a variety of reasons. So that's why you see that flow rate go up in the winter. And it's a little bit of a diluted flow where you get more of a, stronger, I would say, flow where you have less rainwater entering the system in the summertime. So part of the wastewater treatment plant also includes a very unique solids handling component. The city did get a grant, I think several years ago, to do a solids composting program. So you can actually buy Class A compost, basically almost like topsoil from the wastewater treatment plant. And that's solids that is processed off the treatment plant and treated to be acceptable to use for any use, and that includes in your household garden. Total volume there is typically around 2,700 cubic yards of composted solids. It also processes in that process sawdust from local mills to get to that. Some other communities use just trucking and hauling, where they haul that solid over to Eastern Oregon and it's farm applied. That has its pros and cons as well. That the city was fortunate to get the composting set up here so that we are able to pretty much locally process everything and not have to truck stuff to Eastern Oregon. The system is also unique in the fact that it has a chlorinated reuse system. So basically two things that the plant produces. One is solids and the solid processing, that's the composting. The other is liquid, and that's usually water. And by the time it leaves the plant, the water is capable of being discharged directly to the Willamette River, where it just flows right into the system. It's fully compliant with all regulatory requirements for being discharged to the river. But in addition to that, we also have the ability to chlorinate and reuse that water, which is typically reused in the summertime at the golf course. It's our primary reuse customer, but there is the ability potentially to have more reuse customers. I think there's some subdivisions that are doing some reuse, but basically there's or what they call purple pipe or reclaimed water line that runs from the wastewater treatment plant to the golf course. And so any property that would develop along that line could potentially use that reuse water for an industrial process or something of that regard, if that need arose in the future.
And that's the line that goes to Chehalem
Mhm.
Golf Course. South Dakota.
Yep, discharges to their ponds, and then their irrigation system picks up off the ponds and then irrigates the golf course with that water.
Has PCC ever looked into possibly using that as well? Which is right, I assume right along that line.
I think, there's been,
It's not very big.
yeah, questions, it gets into the economics, I think,
Yeah.
of does it make sense to extend or connect or pay the extra sort of metering fees and stuff like that for reuse versus simply using drinking water.
Yeah.
At everybody's home, anybody that's irrigating their personal yard, you're using drinking water for that irrigation. You're not using
The
reclaimed
reuse,
water for
yeah.
use. Yeah, and that's, largely due to cost. Next slide. So in the sanitary sewer system, the big ones are base system operation and maintenance. The plant processing uses a lot of material, chemicals, electricity, and anything that's moving, pump, motor, eventually it breaks, has to be replaced, has to be fixed, has to be maintained, has to be serviced. All of those things are part of the plant process. Lift stations are very much the same way. These are pumps, these are electric-based systems that have moving parts and all need to be maintained. Pipes and pipe maintenance, pipe blockages are another big one. Tree roots love gravity sewer lines. They seek them out quite miraculously and are able to work basically through the cracks and joints. Pipe joints vary based on what pipe you're using. And so typically older pipes are more prone to in what we call infrastructure aging, I&I, inflow and infiltration, where as pipes age, the ground will move a little bit and those pipes will tend to separate or fail or thin or crack. And so there's more maintenance that goes with those. This is an example of tree roots in a pipe that was excavated, just to show you the power of tree roots. They start really, really small and they get really big and they will bust a pipe right in half. System efficiency is also a concern ongoing, particularly as it relates to capital improvements. The more efficient we can get, if we can do a system improvement where we can do a gravity pipe to replace a pump station or lift station, then that's a good thing, because even though we're making that initial capital investment, we're also reducing our ongoing O&M costs. So sometimes some of those big capital expenses can help offset and reduce ongoing operation and maintenance costs. Next slide. Here's another just example of pipes and pipe systems in the gravity sewer system. An example of I&I where pipe joints have slowly separated over time with ground movement. And then you can see in this picture an example of a video that was taken of a line that separated, and this is actually just groundwater seeping into the pipe through the joints. No root problems here yet, but certainly a problem with groundwater infiltration. That infiltrated water makes its way to the wastewater treatment plant, also has to be treated just like any other water that enters the sanitary sewer system, and is an additional expense. So one of the things that we also do typically in our capital improvement program for wastewater is pipe repair, pipe maintenance. Pipe lining is a good, very effective way, cost-effective way of dealing with this kind of concern, where we can slip a liner into this pipe, seal it up, and mitigate a lot of that I&I. Manholes are another source of infiltration where water flows in through joints, cracks, pick holes, you name it, on manholes, particularly in the wintertime. Next slide. Drinking water system is our other big utility. We'll have additional time to talk about, but it's really broken down. The way I look at it is source water. Where are we getting our drinking water from? Water treatment, how are we processing that source water so that it's good for us to consume? And storage. How do we store water, particularly as it relates to maintaining reliable flow and supply, particularly for firefighting needs or for peak use. Storage helps basically moderate how we produce and use water, because typically people will use water at certain key points of the day, when they get up, when they come home, when they go to bed. And then of course industry is using their different times and peaks as well. And so storage helps us moderate those different highs and lows, as well as provide for fire flow where we may need a whole bunch of water in a very short period of time. And then our water distribution system takes it from where the treatment plant is and from the storage facilities to everybody's individual home and or business. Next slide.
But where does most of Newburgh's water come from? The Willamette or from wells, or where does?
All from wells. That's the next slide, actually.
Okay, sorry.
So, or yeah, the next slide maybe after this one. So this is just a overall map basically of Newburgh. Everything in yellow is basically the city, and then there's some urban reserve areas that are sort of highlighted in different colors. But in general, you can see, if you can see it, all the blue lines are sort of our main water lines. And then our shown on the map is on the very south end of town is the water treatment plant that processes groundwater from wells that are actually outside of Yamhill County and located on the other side of the river. The city owns a well field in that location that has served the city with water for basically the entire, I think, existence of the city.
And that's pumped under the river, correct?
Yep, both under and over the river to get to the water treatment plant on the other side. Our groundwater system wells are close to the Willamette River, but they are isolated from the Willamette River based on the geological structure of the soil in that area. So we're not actually really taking Willamette River water. We're taking groundwater that's located in a separate layer of rock and soil that's separated from the Willamette River. And in that layer is really good, high quality water, but it also has iron from the rock, as well as manganese from the rock, which are quite common in this area, naturally occurring elements that basically get in the water. And so, you think of iron, you think of like something like a wheel or heavy, or a shovel, something metallic, right? Most iron in nature actually is liquefied. So it's actually in the water that's in the ground, and it is part of the water. So if you look at a raw iron element, it will occur in the ground as just and get basically sucked in as water. Most trace minerals will, and it just, when it comes out of the groundwater well, it'll look clear. But as you add air to that water, the iron and the minerals start to separate from the water itself. And so That's the iron basically separating from the water molecule and creating its own iron molecule, which is a solid, which is naturally red, actually in color. Manganese is a little different color naturally. And those are the minerals that we're pulling out of the water at the groundwater treatment plant to meet both regulatory requirements for drinking water as well as just basic taste and use. If you think of iron and water, nobody wants to see a red stain in their laundry. And so that's all getting separated out at the drinking water plant. Then from there, it gets transported through the system into the storage reservoirs that are located on the east and north ends of town. Next slide.
Has the water in Newburgh always been chlorinated?
Yes, and well, let me check that. In modern era, the water is always chlorinated. My guess is and I don't know the history of Newburgh, but most places when they first started pulling drinking water, they didn't chlorinate. This led to communicable, really water-related, waterborne illness and disease, cholera, those kinds of issues, very common in the 1920s and 30s to see those kinds of waterborne illnesses. Then we discovered how the world works and that there are microorganisms and all of that. And we now use chlorine. Pretty much, I'm guessing those regulations went into effect in the 50s and 60s. So my guess is somewhere in that time frame, you started using chlorination on all your drinking water. And of course, we refine that and improve that process over time to have the correct amount of chlorination to have safe drinking water, but not to over chlorinate the water so you don't have other problems as well. So it's a complex system that definitely requires a lot of mechanical and physical process as well as personnel. And so those are driving the cost of the basic rates. Here's example pictures of the groundwater wells that are located on that farm side of the Willamette River. In the middle is a picture of the old ODOT bridge for the road that used to trout go through there. That bridge has been closed for quite some time, but we still use that legacy bridge for transporting water. The city's main source of water from the well field to the city has been through that 24-inch line. The city did construct a second line that's just to the left and off of this picture that goes underneath the river and is seismically secure and capable of withstanding a major earthquake. If we did have an earthquake, the existing 24-inch line, we're using both, but that existing 24-inch line on the old bridge would probably be out of service and probably permanently decommissioned if we had a major earthquake. But we're using that while we have it. And of course, like I said, we have the big line, 36-inch line, I believe, that goes under the river that is seismically secure. It'll withstand pretty much anything. And then all of that comes to the treatment plant, which is up in the upper right. And you can't really exactly perfectly see it, but you can sort of see the red in that big white sort of tank area. It's really an open system, but you can see the iron that's pulled out through the sand filtration process and stored in that tank, where it then gets transported and pumped over to the wastewater treatment plant to treat and dispose of the solid iron along with the other solids at the plant. So that's our water system. Big issues here: seismic resiliency. All of your water system is pressurized to keep it safe for drinking water, and anything pressurized is always subject to failure in a earth shaking kind of event. So that's a big one to prepare for where we live long term. Also, just basic maintenance. You can see break in the one picture where the pipes failed. Breaks can happen for any number of reasons, particularly older pipe. Modern pipe, ductile iron and plastics, pretty resilient. The older pipes of yesterday, like cast iron, tend to break with ground movement. They're not really designed for a lot of that. I think Newburgh has some galvanized lines, also not designed to last forever. For scale, I would say modern cast or modern ductile iron pipe installed correctly could last anywhere from 100 to 200 years. A cast iron line really is not designed to last more than 50 to 75 years. Realistically, design life on that's more closer to 40. Most cast iron lines were built in 1970 or earlier. So you can see that all those cast iron lines, so anything 1970 and earlier is basically ready for replacement right now because it's over 50 years old and starting to fail. So a lot of investment there for the older parts of town. Part of that too shows up in House Bill 2001, which allows higher density uses in single family residential zones. Basically in Oregon, after last year, there's no longer a single family zone in Oregon. If anybody has been following that, instead of 1 unit per lot, the state legislature has decided that you can have up to 4 units per lot. And every city is working through that in their own way. Newburgh has worked through that in our own way. And as a part of that, we are required by HB 2001 to improve a lot of the older existing water lines, particularly south of downtown, I believe, where there's a lot of undersized lines that couldn't accommodate that level of density of use. So again, when you're talking utilities, there's usually 2 primary drivers to a utility cost. Or I'd say 2.5. I'll combine one cost is basic operation and inflation. Every year things get more expensive, thus the basic and operation gets more expensive. The other part to every utility is regulatory drivers. So if the state or the federal government or some other regulatory issue comes up, there's going to be a need to invest in that utility to meet those regulatory requirements. And HB 2001 is an example of one of those. Other picture is just a hydrant flushing. Again, one of the regular maintenance portions. It's not just sitting in the line and waiting to be used. There's active maintenance occurring all the time on our systems. An example of that for the water system is regular hydrant flushing, valve exercising, where we're making sure that each one of those components is working and is available when they are needed. Next slide. Stormwater system, relatively newer utility function. You know, back in the days, 50s, 60s, 70s, I would say even in the 80s, you just sort of drained to the river or the creek and out it went and nobody cared. And then people started like wanting to be able to swim and use the Willamette River and other creeks and rivers because not necessarily the best stuff was coming down those systems. And so basically the Clean Water Act came into existence in the 70s. That was then strengthened in the 80s and 90s, and it really became a full-fledged effort, I would say, in the mid-90s to really control stormwater discharge, make sure that pretty much rainwater and groundwater is flowing to the collection stormwater system, and that we started actively working on not just building pipes and inlets and getting water to flow where we wanted it to flow, which is a function, but also treating that and making sure that the discharge was appropriate to wherever it's draining to. So new systems are now in place. You see those with every new subdivision that gets built. any new systems coming online will always have some sort of treatment or detention system where we're controlling either volume, where we're trying to keep that volume from requiring bigger downstream pipes or systems, or bigger, or trying to prevent scour of creeks in the river, or treatment of the stormwater, which is localized. So a lot of improvements, typically on water quality facilities, we're using mostly natural systems to treat that water before it gets into the streams and creeks. And basically, when you're treating stormwater, what you're really trying to accomplish is eliminating some suspended solids, any kind of mud or those kinds of things from downstream, but also, and probably more importantly, things like street sweeping, things like water quality facilities also capture heavy metals and those kinds of discharges, as well as pesticides and herbicides. A lot of pesticide and herbicide overuse in residential areas in particular can contribute to downstream issues and concerns in the creeks and rivers. Streets contribute a lot to issues as well. Brake dust contributes heavy metal that can collect in those systems. And so we're also concerned about that to make sure we're appropriately taking care of our natural waterways, streams, fish, all of that good stuff. And again, more regulation. Pretty much everything in Newburgh discharges to the Willamette River ultimately. Next slide. Again, here's just sort of example of how that works. You usually have small systems, could be the downspout on your house, draining all the way down through creeks and our waterways and channels ultimately to the river. And this is picked up in these catch basins and inlets. These are not connected to the wastewater treatment plant. So I always tell people, please don't throw your garbage or your dog waste or whatever into the stormwater system. That's going straight to the rivers and creeks. This is really designed to just capture rainwater and rain flow that occurs naturally and drains through our system to those natural creek and river watershed areas. Next slide.
Out of curiosity, are there any restrictions on rain barrels in Newburgh?
I don't think there's any restrictions that I'm aware of for rain barrels.
We talked about this. For the system to work, you had to have so much flow to get into the system to use it. I thought there was somewhere.
Are you talking like individual rain barrels on your house?
Individual, yes.
Yeah, so those are great. I mean, there's no restriction on that. But if you think about rain in Oregon, the problem with reuse of rainwater in Oregon is we don't have any rain all summer, and then we have like constant rain all winter. And so when you need, like if you're using a rain barrel for irrigation or something, when you need that water, it's really not going to be there because it's not going to rain for several months, like June, July, August, right? And then it'll be like overflowing full December, January, February. So I mean, those are great thoughts. Cisterns are always great thoughts. Those kinds of items, cost effectively, they just, for Oregon, it's not not necessarily a perfect system, particularly in where we live.
Yeah, I mean, I was just curious, 'cause I think I've read other places do restrict those. I know I have one that was in the house when I bought it, and you're right, it overflows in the winter. But at some point you get to use at least what's in there.
Yeah.
And at least it doesn't have all the chlorination that the regular water does.
Yeah, and of course you can dechlorinate regular water, but that's an extra step that most people don't take. Right?
Yeah.
And in Newburgh, our area is really broken up into 3 watersheds for stormwater. It's Springbrook, Hess, and Chehalem creeks that all flow to the Willamette River. You can see the big purple lines are on your map here, are basically where those creeks are located. And then the colored areas represent the topography of what flows to each individual creek. So you can see that the topography of Newburgh is such that it's mostly draining from the north to the south. But the way the city is structured, it just varies a little bit on which parts drain to which creek. And of course, for Chehalem, there's different tributaries and side channels and ditches and stuff that ultimately make their way to that area. Next slide. Hess is the main one that runs right through the middle of town. Issues, again, always the issue with every utility is maintenance, basic operations. In stormwater, it's cleaning all those catch basins, maintaining all that pipe. We have a number of catch basins that have to be sucked out and removed. That's the mechanical part of the treatment, really, is whatever's captured in catch basins or our water quality manholes get sucked out and cleaned on a regular basis. The ones that you probably see more at ground level are like stormwater detention facilities, like one pictured here, where that facility allows water to discharge from the street and the neighborhood and surrounding areas to this facility. Natural ground basically pulls a lot of that first flush heavy metals and particulates and pesticides or whatever out of that. And then once it gets through this facility, it gets goes on downstream through a pipe network towards the ultimate discharge point at one of the creeks and or ultimately to the Willamette River. Another part, like we mentioned, is regulatory. Department of Environmental Quality requires the city of Newburgh to do a TMDL, or total maximum daily load program, monitoring and reporting system. So we're constantly monitoring for temperature in streams. We're monitoring for other factors in the streams. All that gets reported back to the state DEQ to make sure that the discharge that's being released from the city of Newburgh meets their basic requirements for discharge to those creeks and ultimately to the river. Part of that TMDL program is also education. So even me, being here tonight, telling people don't throw garbage into the storm system is a part of our educational message. You can also see that a lot on individual storm manholes where we place placards and stuff like that. We also do online outreach and education and other efforts to educate the community on stormwater maintenance and management. Next slide. Again, those are all systems that, that didn't occur in the 70s. Nobody was getting educated on any of that. So it makes it cheaper, but also not as environmentally responsible. Transportation network and system or road infrastructure for the most part. This is tough. This is really the transportation maintenance fee is home here. In addition to the transportation utility fee, we also have, like I mentioned earlier, gas tax, which is a shared revenue from the state that is based on a per capita basis. So every city gets so much per capita from the state. That money is broken up. We don't get any of the federal gas tax. The feds take that and divvy it up. What we get is a portion of the state gas tax. And I believe the majority of the state gas tax goes to the state for maintaining the freeway systems and rural highways. And then another substantial portion of the gas tax goes to the counties. They maintain all the county roads and infrastructure. And then the smallest portion of gas tax goes to what I consider one of the heaviest users, certainly with the most lane miles of road, and that is to the local communities. And so Newburgh gets a portion of that. We use that gas tax to pay for basic pothole maintenance, any kind of winter weather maintenance. Hopefully not too much snow in Newburgh, but that is a function. We also have to maintain sidewalk ramps, those kinds of things. That's a big function of the gas tax as well. And so in our transportation system, you can really break it down into, I call 4 main categories: basic vehicular pavement, sidewalk, and handicap ramps. Handicap ramps are again a regulatory requirement that is been pushed here in the last several years with ADA requirements to really require the state and local agencies to invest heavily in ADA access and access improvements. Bike facilities are also a state regulatory item. Any arterial roadway in Oregon is required to have bikeways installed if they're new. And so a lot of bike facilities and desirable needs for bike facilities as well. So that, you know, people can get safely where they want to go. Transit is also a function of transportation, although in Newburgh, we don't really have a city operated transit system. That's really done separately, I believe through Yamhill County. And in particular for the utility transportation utility fee, the focus is pavement. Everything else is traditionally funded through other means, but pavement maintenance in particular is where the utility fee comes in. Next slide. Again, this is just a general overview map of our roadway network, and color coded to show what parts are maintained by the county, what parts are maintained by ODOT, and what parts are maintained by the city of Newburgh. So even though for us, the state gets a majority of the money and then the county gets the second biggest chunk, you can see on this map, the city's got the vast majority of the infrastructure. Granted, the state has to maintain freeways and other really intense uses that contribute a lot to cost, but the local network also is substantial. Next slide. Issues with our local pavement is really just basic pavement maintenance, right? So it's potholes, pavement wears out over time, asphalt doesn't last forever. Water and the Oregon environment really chews away at basic asphalt, will separate asphalt from the aggregate and causes delamination, potholing, pavement failure, rutting. I always fear winter freeze-thaw cycles because they will ruin streets, and it's gotten noticeably worse, I believe, in my 25-year career from where we were a few decades ago, with more extreme weather events that contribute to that kind of issue. Other items, like I said, sidewalk gaps, ADA facilities is a big one. Creating handicap accessible facilities that meet modern ADA design requirements and any bike facility gaps. Again, for the tough utility portion of our infrastructure, it's really about maintaining the existing pavement. And we have pavement condition indexing. We rank and rate all of the streets in town that we can then prioritize where to best utilize those transportation utility fee funds to do basic pavement maintenance. A lot of that is done in coordination with the other utilities. The last thing we want to do is resurface a road and then have another utility, whether it's water or sewer or natural gas or communications, whoever, come tear that road up. So we're always coordinating with other utilities to make sure that we're getting the best bang for our buck with the transportation utility fee. Next slide.
One question, and it's probably beyond the scope of this, I assume, but I mean, there's roads in Newburgh that aren't paved at all. Like, I don't know, Fifth Street on the other side of Dayton Avenue, as an example. I mean, there's other
the gravel streets.
Yeah, the gravel streets,
Mhm.
what's up with that?
So, gravel streets, that'll be, I'm sure, an ongoing conversation. There is some basic maintenance obviously there as well. I mean, every gravel street has, particularly dust control is something that people may not realize is happening on most of those gravel streets, plus regrading and shaping. They're actually a heavy, maintenance component to gravel streets, which is why we pretty much gotten away from them in general. It used to be everything used to be gravel back, when I was a little kid. And that all went away because the maintenance component was just very expensive. And so usually what you see with gravel streets is a eventual transition to some sort of solid surface. That could be chip and seal, that could be asphalt, it could be any number of ways. The trick with that is figuring out how to get the capital money to pay for that initial capital investment. And so that's why you probably still see some of those gravel streets around town, is that there's just hasn't been the means to figure out a way to effectively get that capital investment made and then split up that cost in a way that seems equitable.
Yeah, and I know it's a trade-off, I'm sure, between do we maintain some existing paved road or do we finally pave one of these old gravel streets? Not that I live on any of them, but
Right.
those over there, like I said, off of Dayton, I think, I don't know, Sherman, and some of those, I think, eventually are gravel over in there,
Yeah, and the other thing to remember with gravel streets is they're somewhat pervious, so water can infiltrate. When you're converting from gravel to pave, you're automatically also adding not just the solid surface, but you're also adding some component of stormwater
runoff.
that has to be addressed as well under the modern systems. So typically when you're talking capital improvements in streets, you're simultaneously talking improvements in stormwater.
Yeah.
Next slide. For pavement condition indexing, we have a system. It's based on basically a scale of 0 to 100. 100 is perfect, brand new. 0 is gravel or dirt and terrible. And so, and then everything in between. So typically a good street would be a PCI of 70 or better. Fair is starting to show signs of wear, some cracking, maybe some alligatoring, some delaminating or raveling. And then poor is really like, your pothole laden street, pretty much anything I'd say 45 and under isn't good. You get really low into 10s and 20s. That's when it's pretty rough. Next slide. And of course, each different PCI rating could trigger a different type of treatment. So one of the things that we're typically doing with pavement maintenance is we're trying to keep that pavement rating up. So because it's incrementally more expensive to do those bigger fixes on a much worse condition road. So if I can just do a simple sort of slurry seal and extend that pavement life, that's a much lower cost per square yard than complete reconstruction of a road that's failed. And we are doing a lot more creative things nowadays than we used to. Things like cement treated base, which was successfully applied this year on a couple of roads, helps minimize inconvenience as well as cost, particularly cost, while bringing up that street to an acceptable condition over a very long period of time. Sidewalks and ramps, again, I just throw it in here because it's a regulatory item. We have to do a lot of that work, particularly ramps whenever we're resurfacing a road. It used to be that you could just sort of let it go. A lot of issues like the cracked sidewalk on the right side of the screen would be the cost of the adjacent property owner through some sort of code enforcement action. That has its own issues sometimes. But the picture on the left of the curb, street, sidewalk with no ramp, that is a requirement of the city to fix every time we go out and do pavement maintenance. So we can leave it as it is for the existing condition, but if we resurface the road, we have to go in and improve the handicap ramps in accordance with both state and federal law. Next slide. And I think that's the end. So any questions on the general overview of capital? Again, we'll be getting into more details when we get into each individual section.
All right, if that concludes all the presentations. Yes, yes, excellent. The next topic is public comment. I will now open the floor to public comment. Jean, do we have any public comments? Oh, Jen, sorry. My eyes are going blur.
No, we do not.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
If there are none, I will close the public comment session. Katie, can you please take us through the next agenda before we adjourn?
Okay, can you put up the last slide? I just wanted to go over the future dates, which I will send to the committee, just so we know all of the dates we have
That's
for the
cheating.
next.
I think I'm funny. My kids don't either.
There we go.
Yes.
So our next meeting will be September 13th, and that will be the first part of the water system that we will see. So, and then these are the rest of the dates, which I will send out to the committee. We may not need to meet February 7th on there, so that one's just kind of tentative. So we will see once we get closer to that, but just so everybody kind of has the dates ahead of time and you can pencil them in. So I think that's all I have, so I'll pass it back to the chair.
In preparation for these, I think one of the most common comments is comparison. I lived in, pick your favorite state locally to us. I moved to Newburgh, my bill's higher. Why? I think having that context to the committee and having it captured is helpful, because as you've already thoroughly gone through, and also Deb, your system is the basis of your cost. And there's some systems that have very low cost that we don't have here. This is not a viable option for Newburgh. I think comparing and contrasting that a little bit, we will have a portion of the final assessment that does have a small comparison. We usually pay for that. I think is that planned this year to also have that comparison?
Yes, I think we did decide to do that. And yes, that's good to hear because we always hear comparisons to McMinnville Water and Light. It's a totally different utility system than what we have in Newburgh, which is why the
Tiger,
rates are
Sherwood, I mean,
totally different.
It's important to capture that because that's going to be the key critical comment, right? Is that it costs too much for Newburgh. And so it's helpful to have the context for that. Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you, I appreciate
I
that.
agree completely. I mean, I've seen so many comments about people complaining about Newburgh rates, and some kind of competitive benchmarking versus neighboring cities would be great.
I'm just thankful I'm not paying my Seattle fees anymore. Those were expensive. All right. That's that. We already talked about the date. Cool, adjournment. So rate review committee is now adjourned.